So, continuing the series that I've been putting together, each one including 10 VYou shorts, here's 10 more VYou clips. All of these have to do with ethics, and they have to do with, in particular, moral theories of one type or another. You notice that there's a lot on hedonism in there, but a little bit about natural law and a little bit about some of the other theories as well. So here they are, 10 more clips.
So, do I think that it matters that our sources for moral decisions are conflicted? And the question is making some reference to, I think, the trolley problem, sort of a long standby, a very stark question that gets put in a lot of intro to ethics classes when we're first trying to pose, moral dilemmas. I'm not very interested in the trolley problem itself, but I am interested in this question. What are the sources for our moral decisions? Do we have the right sources to begin with, and are we giving them the right weight? And then what do we do when they conflict? So these questions are all interrelated, because figuring out what to do when you have different sources conflicting, let's say you have conscience telling you one thing, and perhaps a moral code which is prevalent within your society telling you another thing, and somebody whose opinion you trust and really respect telling you a third thing, and maybe they don't all jibe. Well, then you're posed with the problem of figuring out which one to give the greatest weight to. And you can put this in terms of logic versus emotion. I don't find that particularly helpful, because when people invoke logic or rationality, it's not as if there aren't different levels of rationality or better and worse, logics. If you're doing practical reasoning about moral life, whatever you're calling reason has to be broad enough to actually encompass the sort of things that we're interested in. So if logic means, just formal logic, then it's not going to be much use to you. A lot more to be said here, but time's running out, so. So this is a good question from one of my ethics students as well. Is hedonism a good moral theory? Well, it really depends on what you mean by good. Every moral theory, by virtue of being a moral theory, involves taking some sort of position on what is right and wrong, or what's good and bad, and how various goods, roll into each other or should be arranged against each other, or what should be sacrificed to what, or how things should be ordered. So hedonism says that the only true good is pleasure, or the lack of pain. Everything else, friendship, relationships, duty, reputation, virtue, all those other sorts of things are merely valued because they bring about pleasure for the person involved, or they remove pain for the person involved. So that's how it defines the good. And if you stick strictly within a hedonistic viewpoint, you don't really have any way of saying that it's not a good moral theory, right? Because by its own lights, it would be a good moral theory. If pleasure is indeed the only good, then wouldn't it be better to be straight about that and just go straight after pleasure, like Aristippus advises? Okay, so that said, if you want to ask the broader question of whether it's a good moral theory, you have to figure out what you mean by good. So if you mean something like respecting the rights of others, or promoting self-development, or leading a person towards virtue and away from vice, or bringing a person to do their duty, it's probably not going to be a very good moral theory. And that may point you towards the failures of hedonism. It's kind of a restricted moral theory. It makes the world very small, doesn't it? So this is a really interesting question that a lot of my students were worried about when I had them writing about hedonism after I had them studying two classical hedonist philosophers from the ancient period, Aristippus, who basically said physical pleasure is the good, and Epictetus, who said that mental pleasure is actually better than physical pleasure, and that is the good. If I do want pleasure, which I do, we all do actually, right? Does that make me a hedonist? It's not enough just to desire pleasure to be a hedonist, because other moral theories do take stock of the fact that we human beings, and actually all sentient beings, desire pleasure. It's whether you make that the be-all and end-all of moral decision-making that decides whether you're a hedonist or not. So, if, for instance, you were to say, I really like shopping, right? Some of my students wrote about that. I really like shopping. I get a lot of enjoyment out of it. That by itself doesn't make you a hedonist. It's deciding to prioritize that. Let's say that's the highest good for you, shopping, right? That's the highest pleasure. If you were to say, well, I'm going to sacrifice everything else to shopping, okay, then you're a hedonist, right? Because you're pursuing pleasure to the detriment or sacrifice or exclusion of other goods. If you were to weigh all other goods against it and say, well, nothing as good as shopping because shopping gives me the most pleasure, and you ignored other things like, say, duty or virtue or self-development or relationships with others, yes, then you would be a hedonist. But simply desiring pleasure by itself, that just makes you a human being. That doesn't make you a hedonist. Can you be kind of a hedonist without being completely hedonistic? Yes. As a matter of fact, this ties in with one of the other answers that I just gave. Recognizing that you in fact desire pleasure and are averse to pain is not the same thing as espousing a hedonistic lifestyle or moral theory or embracing it, wholesale. Can you be kind of a hedonist without being completely hedonist? Yes and no. If by kind of a hedonist you mean actually pursuing pleasure, but within certain limits that are not just given by whether they're going to lead you to other pleasures or prevent you from having other pleasures or things like that, but limits that are given to you from some other source that doesn't just boil down in last analysis to pleasure, like conscience or duty or virtue or something along those lines, saying that those are not just a matter of pleasure, or maintaining a relationship, for example. If you've got those kind of limits and you're also pursuing pleasure, you would be doing something hedonistic, but you wouldn't be a hedonist yourself. Great example of this is Aristotle. Aristotle says pleasure is a good, and there's lots of pleasant goods out there, and you wouldn't want to have a life that doesn't include pleasure. But pleasure by itself is not the one single value that you want to make everything else turn around, because that's kind of a slavish, animalistic kind of existence. There's higher values, and when those higher values are realized by you, you actually do have pleasure in them, but you're not pursuing them just for pleasure's sake. So that would be not being a hedonist, right? It would be hedonistic to a certain degree, but not hedonist. So this is a tough one. How do you distinguish a physical pleasure from a mental one? Which is very important if we're looking at hedonistic theories, that is, theories that say that the good is pleasure, or absence of pain. How do we actually distinguish these apart from each other? Two classic hedonists, Aristippus and Epicurus, differed on which were better. Aristippus said, mental pleasures, they're not really that pleasurable. Physical pleasures, that's where it's at. Epicurus said the opposite. He said, well, physical pleasures, they're limited, and you got to keep repeating them, whereas mental pleasures are more lasting, more fulfilling. How do you distinguish them, though? Well, I think there's going to be a lot of mixed pleasures. I think there's going to be some that have a physical element but are primarily mental pleasures. Think about the act of reading, for example. Let's say you actually enjoy reading, as I would say most students do, right? Most people who crack books open do. at least when they're reading things that they like. What's being engaged? Is it primarily your body, or is it primarily your mind? I'd say it's primarily your mind, and you could add physical things to it that would improve the pleasurableness of the situation, but it's still primarily a mental pleasure, right? So sipping a coffee, which is a physical pleasure, while you're reading your book, it's still primarily a mental pleasure. Let's take a different example, though. Not coffee, but say wine or beer, if you're kind of a connoisseur. Okay, it's a physical pleasure, right? The intoxication, but the taste itself, is that purely physical, or once your palate has been educated, is there a mental component to it? Some sort of cultivation that's taking place. I would say it's sort of mixed. It's half and half, and so it really depends, doesn't it? So an interesting philosophy question, not coming from one of my students, but somebody who evidently has read some utilitarian theory and been highly impressed by it. Should utilitarianism be considered the morally conscious perspective in the world as humans become more and more interdependent? No. The word "the" there, as opposed to "a," that's the problem. Utilitarians often think that they can subsume all other moral perspectives into their own, and they're wrong. They don't hold up when you scrutinize them. And the cure for that is more reading, looking at other perspectives in ethics, in moral theory, and then you start seeing some of the gaps, some of the flaws in utilitarianism, even in its best proponents. Utilitarianism can go along with, and actually in practice does go along with, some pretty horrific things, as well as some many good things. Oftentimes utilitarian thinking is just what the doctor ordered, but when you're trying to think of moral theory, you want to have a toolbox that's got more than one tool in it. So deontological or duty-based ethics, very important. Virtue ethics, very important. Natural law theory has some things going for it. I think that it's important to study these sort of things before trying to hammer everything with a hammer, even if it requires a wrench, a saw, a screwdriver. Well, there you go. I mean, the word that you choose tells you what's going on. Indoctrination, whether it's by Peter Singer or John Rawls or Ayn Rand or anybody, who's sort of a big name, famous philosopher who's also kind of superficial, as all three of those are. It's not going to be any good. Actually, even indoctrination by Plato or Hegel or some real first-rate philosophers, if it's just indoctrination, it's not real philosophy. That's sort of antithetical to the very spirit that animates philosophy down through the ages. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. If you admit to yourself that you've been indoctrinated, you know what you need to do, which is read a lot more and have an open mind as you're reading. Peter Singer, just as a footnote, I've read him. Not very impressed, in part because I think he doesn't get other people right, and that is a sign to me of a lower grade thinker. They fit everything into the schema that they've got. And within that schema, they're very coherent. That's why it's attractive to people reading philosophy early on. It provides a coherent worldview, but hey, part of the test of whether something passes muster is whether you can get other people who don't already buy the program to see something to the program. So that's what I'd encourage you to think about, and hopefully this isn't too harsh. So this is a great question. Great in part because I've got a great answer for it that you wouldn't even suspect by the way that the question is framed. With nature versus nurture, how does philosophy enlighten that perspective with society? Well, here's the thing. Is it just nature versus nurture? Is that the whole picture? That's what they tell you in class, in some of your classes, right? But that's not the case. And here's something that philosophers or at least some philosophers know about, and theologians know about, and some literary people know about, but psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, they've totally lost sight of. We have wills. We have a faculty of the will. We don't just have intellects. We don't just have appetites. This is something that was discovered along the way, and philosophers have given a lot of thought to this, and there are different theories out there. Some of them may be more right than others, but you'll never know about it unless you actually read some philosophy or read some theology or read some literature. And if you do, it can be quite illuminating. Why don't the scientists or the social scientists want to treat it? Well, because it's not easily treated. It doesn't fit into the sort of matrices that their disciplines require. Which doesn't mean it's not real. It means that there's a huge, huge aspect of reality, the metaphysics of ordinary life and of moral life and of human actions that they can't take account of. No matter how many ways they quantify it statistically or study it, they're missing out on something fundamental. We do have a faculty of the will. And if you want to study it, best place to do it, philosophy. Do I think people were more moral in Plato's time than ours? On the whole, no. I think that they had somewhat different issues that they were struggling with, and they had a culture that in some ways made it easier for them to choose paths that were moral or at least to some degree morally justified. But I think that they faced a lot of the same basic perennial problems that people did 100 years later, 1,000 years later, and in our time and will 1,000 years from now as well. There's certain constants of human nature that aren't going to go away, and each generation has to do it over and over and over again, because you come into this world without having some sort of automatic moral sense or compass that's going to tell you what to do. And you learn about what's right and wrong through cultures that are by themselves, sites where people are trying to get over and where things don't always work the way they're supposed to, and people provide bad examples as well as good examples, and where there's a lot of arguments, a lot of discord about what's right and wrong. I mean, that's the way right and wrong is, by the way. It's always going to be that way. Some people are always going to be saying that the wrong thing is the right thing, and vice versa. So I don't think that we should say that people were in fact more moral in Plato's time. As a matter of fact, I think one of the reasons why Plato is writing what he is and actually suggesting it's kind of utopian in his own time is because most people were, either just so-so with their moral life or were actually kind of badly off. Same thing in Aristotle's time, same thing in Thomas Aquinas, same thing for Kant. Same thing. Well, unfortunately, I don't have any good answers for you on this one. Good introductions to natural law theory, because when I actually teach natural law in the classes where I get to do it, and quite frankly, I haven't gotten to teach anything like a graduate level ethics course or some study just of natural law by itself. So I'm teaching things in survey classes. I actually just start with Thomas Aquinas, and I talk about the general notion of natural law, and then we work through a bit of that, and that's usually enough for them to wrap their heads around after we go through the most general precept and the three more specific precepts, and then start applying them to cases and all that. There is a whole literature out there. There are people who specialize in that sort of thing, and I have to admit that I found many of them really scholastic and almost stultifyingly boring. And there, some of them are people who are associated with the, quote-unquote revival of natural law, like, Finis and Grisey, but again, not my cup of tea. Jacques Maritain has a pretty nice little book on natural law that you could check out. Alistair McIntyre has talked quite a bit about it as he moved from Aristotelian virtue ethics conception to a Thomistic natural law conception, and so I would look around in some of his works. But for contemporary stuff, I think you need to find somebody who really likes that kind of literature and specializes in it. It's best just to go back to Thomas,